Okay, guys, so this topic is called savings and investment. I'm really excited to discuss this topic with you guys because it's related to a lot of questions that I get from my students. So I've tried to put together some knowledge that I've gathered over the years about savings and about investing, about how to make your money in a lot of financial markets. So this is loosely based on Chapter 17, but it's primarily based on a lot of other books I've read and my own personal experience with this. So take everything I say in here with a grain of salt. What was right for me might not be right for everybody. Personal finance is a very, very diverse field that I am not an expert in. It's not necessarily related to economics, but I do have a little bit of knowledge about these things and how they relate to our course. So we're going to talk about that. So the key questions for this topic are, how can I guard against macroeconomic changes? And also, how do I protect and grow my wealth over time? So the first thing I want to start with is our definition of inflation. And now if you're in my macroeconomics class, you've probably seen this before, so this is a little bit of a reminder. But if you're in my microeconomics class, this might be new information. So the idea that prices in our economy tend to increase over time, we call that inflation. So thinking about how a loaf of bread today costs a lot more than a loaf of bread cost back in 1950, a lot of that is due to inflation. An alternative definition of inflation is a decrease in the average purchasing power of a dollar. So you might have heard that inflation decreases the value of your dollar. That's the same thing as an increase in the price level, right? If prices go up, those dollars can buy you less. So both definitions are perfectly fine. So in the United States, we typically experience annual inflation rates of 2 to 3%. Right around 2.5% is what the Federal Reserve targets. And so we have this equation called the Fisher equation that helps us express just how much purchasing power we're losing to inflation. So the Fisher equation is that the real interest rate, real just means values adjusted for inflation, is equal to the nominal interest rate. Nominal just means in the present time or without being adjusted for inflation. And then to adjust for inflation, you just subtract out that inflation rate, which is right around 2 to 3%. So to get an idea of how this affects you, if we are going to assume that the United States has an annual inflation rate of 2.5% and you happen to keep your money in a checking account, most checking accounts don't give you any interest on the money that you keep in there. If you put $100 in your checking account at the beginning of the year, you will have $100 in your checking account at the end of the year. There's no interest earned, so you earn 0% nominal interest. So the real interest rate is going to be that 0% nominal minus inflation. If you keep your money in a checking account, that money is going to lose 2.5% of its purchasing power every single year. Okay? So what that means is if you have $100 at the beginning of the year, you will still see that balance of $100 at the end of the year, but because prices have gone up, it's like the equivalent of having $97.50 at the beginning of the year because those dollars have lost their purchasing power. Similar things happen actually in a savings account. Now, a savings account in the United States, the national average is 0.05%. Which is better than zero, but it's still not very much at all. So if we were to calculate the real interest rate there, you don't lose quite as much to inflation, but you do pretty much lose the same amount to inflation in a savings account. Plus, a savings account will have fees and things like that on top of it. So when I tell my students that their money is losing value sitting in their checking account, sitting in a traditional savings account, occasionally I get the reaction, well, okay, I'll just keep everything in cash and put it in a box under my bed or in the walls of my house, under my mattress. That's not a great idea either because even that can't escape inflation, right? Cash doesn't earn any interest. If you have a $100 bill under your bed, At the end of the year, you will still have that same $100 bill under your bed, but it will probably buy you about 2.5% less stuff. So avoiding banks altogether doesn't solve the problem either. So you might be thinking to yourself, I don't notice that my money is evaporating due to inflation. And the reason you don't notice is because it's subtle, but remember that dollars do not have stagnant value. Dollars are worth exactly what you can get in exchange for them, and that changes over time. A dollar could buy you quite a bit of stuff back in 1950, and nowadays a dollar can't buy you much more than a candy bar, sometimes not even a candy bar after tax, right? So if you think that inflation is not affecting you, you're probably making the same mistake here as Dr. Evil. So a little bit of context if you haven't seen Austin Powers. This guy, Dr. Evil, has been frozen for the last 30 years, and he has a very evil plot to make himself rich, but he forgets to adjust his dollars for inflation.
Here's the plan. We get the warhead, and we hold the world ransom for $1 million.
Don't you think we should maybe ask for more than $1 million? $1 million isn't exactly a lot of money these days. Urchicon alone makes over $9 billion a year.
Really? Mm-hmm. It's not. Okay then. We hold the world ransom for $100 billion.
All right, so the idea that $1 million is always $1 million just simply isn't true, because $1 million isn't a lot of money these days. The same way $100 in your checking account right now is not going to be the same as $100 in your checking account 5 years from now, because 5 years from now prices are going to be much higher, and that $100 isn't going to go as far as it does now. So let's escape this. Jump over here. There we go. So inflation is going to cost you money, and then there's some other reasons that you should learn some saving and investment habits. So I have these links linked in the PDF version of these slides. So if you want to take a look at the data in more detail, you can click on them there. But one reason you should save and invest is because you might have heard this statistic thrown around that 40% of Americans could not cover an unexpected $400 emergency expense on their own. And that's based on a survey that the Federal Reserve did, I believe in 2018. They asked a bunch of Americans, how would you handle an unexpected $400 expense? And 40% of them said they'd have to put it on a credit card, borrow from family or friends, but they really didn't have that $400 on their own. And that's really problematic because, you know, life has these unexpected emergencies, right? Your car breaks down, or you have an unexpected medical expense, or, you know, we're experiencing a lot of unexpected expenses now in the pandemic with people being laid off from their jobs or furloughed. So having a little bit saved up for these things can make a big difference in your quality of life. And then these next two bullet points have to do with retiring. So most Americans aged 50 years or older have less than $30,000 saved for retirement. So for most people, that's less than a year's worth of income. So, you know, we have Americans that are approaching retirement age, and as life expectancy is growing in the United States, if you want to retire and not work for those last several years of your life, you need to have far, far more than $30,000 saved up in order to live comfortably. Additionally, and tied to that, 40% of middle-class Americans, so people who are living in a typical middle-class level right now because they have so little saved up, they are on track to have a much lower standard of living in retirement, at or below the poverty level. So that's pretty problematic. And then additionally, there's some implications here for gender and racial equality and class differences. So a 2019 study, this is by a group called the Brookings Institution, basically shows that financial knowledge is generational. If you come from a moderate or a low-income family, you're less likely to save and invest adequately, like many of the Americans that I've listed in these first 3 bullet points. I know that I came from a moderate to low income family, and I wasn't taught a lot of this about having an emergency fund, about how to save, about how to invest, and what a retirement account is. So that's actually a lot of the motivation behind me developing this module, is try to pass on some of the things that I've learned so that we can break that generational cycle of under preparing financially. So the last study I want to talk about is that women and minorities are the least likely to prepare for their financial future. So women are about 5% less likely than men to have a retirement account at all, to have any sort of retirement savings. And then of the women who do have retirement accounts, most of them are worth less than half the retirement accounts of men. So they're less likely to have one overall. If women do have one, they don't put enough money in it. They don't have enough saved up. Additionally, African American families have about 1/12 of the savings and investments that the median American family has. And so if we think about disparities in gender and racial pay, these disparities grow even larger when we think about wealth and saving over the course of our lives. And a lot of it is tied to that last bullet point we were talking about, the idea that you needed to come from a wealthy family to get a lot of these skills passed on to you. Unfortunately, this isn't something or a skill set that they seem to teach in the school system. So if you learned how to save and how to invest, it was probably from your parents, and your parents had to have money to save and invest in order to teach you. So the good news is that if you are a part of one of these groups or you come from a family who did not teach you these habits, the way to get around it is to empower yourself with knowledge and begin learning on your own. So let's get going with that. So what can you do particularly? First thing you can do is you can save. So saving generally requires setting aside money. You put it in a safe place, a savings account of sorts, and it will earn some modest interest. The good things about saving is there is no risk, virtually no risk, that you will lose your money if you save it at a financial institution. They're also very easy to access your money if you have it in a savings account, and it's easy to understand how a savings account works. The downside is that most savings, because there is no risk, have very low return. So a return has to do with the amount of money you earn. So savings you can earn between 0.5% to 2.5% if you invest wisely. So if we think back to that Fisher equation, oops, moved a little too quickly. There we go. So that Fisher equation we were talking about earlier, Fisher equation said the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate. So nominal is always the one that the bank advertises, and minus inflation. If we take these pretty high, higher than average interest rates, 0.5% to 2.5%, we're still just barely, if at all, going to beat inflation. Interest rates are really low right now. You can expect to maybe get 1% on a good savings account. And so if we have typically 2.5% inflation, we're still going to wind up with negative 1.5% in purchasing power if we just save, right? So it's certainly better to save smart with one of these higher interest accounts than the national average that I used the Fisher equation on earlier a few slides ago. but it's not going to be practical for growing your wealth over time and being ready for retirement. So if you want to do that, if you really want to make a big difference in your money, your wealth growth over time, you need to invest. So investing involves using your money to buy some sort of financial asset. So something of value in our financial markets. So example would be stocks, bonds, mutual funds. I'm going to define all those terms a little bit later. And you're expecting that the value of these financial assets are going to go up over time. The good news about investing is you can expect a much more substantial rate of return or earnings. You can earn 6 to 7% per year if you buy assets like stocks. That being said, there is no reward without risk, right? No risk means no reward. So you can also lose money when you invest, right? So that's one of the big cons of investing is they are higher risk. But you have to take on that risk if you are going to invest well and make a big difference in your financial future, aside from just earning traditional income. Another downside to investing is there's a lot of complicated terminology. I am going to try to cover the basics in this video and in this module, but I could really have an entire course on investing and not even cover the half of it. And frankly, I'm not an expert investor either. I'm just sharing some of the basics that I know. There's a lot of complicated jargon and vocabulary, but the good news is there's a lot of resources online. Just don't be afraid to say that you don't know and to research something if you come across a term that you don't understand. It's probably a lot simpler than it sounds. So, when deciding should you save or should you invest, I recommend you do both. I do a little bit of both personally in my own life. But primarily, most people will start by saving. You should save if you do not have an emergency fund. So an emergency fund is basically 1 to 6 months of your typical living expenses. So adding up all your bills, rent, groceries, gas, insurance, all that stuff. Figure out how much 1 to 6 months of all of that will be and set that aside for if you have an unforeseen financial hardship. It's also good to save if you think you're going to need to access your cash fairly soon for a big purchase like a car or a home in less than 5 years. So I know this emergency fund, 1 to 6 months, that's a pretty wide range. And I know for me, that's a big difference in terms of thousands of dollars, how big my emergency fund should be. Typically, a lot of people just land in the middle. They pick 3 months, or when they're deciding between the 1 or the 6, the more responsibility you have in your adult life, the more you should have saved up as an emergency fund. So if you have a family that you're supporting, maybe you're closer to the 6-month range. If you are a college student and you have parents who are supporting you somewhat financially, maybe you're closer to the 1 month end of the spectrum. You just decide what you are personally comfortable with. It depends on the individual. And then generally you should invest when, 1, you have that emergency fund built up and you're comfortable with it. A lot of people get their first opportunity to invest when they get their first full-time job that offers a employer-sponsored retirement plan. A lot of times your company that you work for will offer retirement benefits, and sometimes they will give you something called an employer match, which means they will give you extra money on top of your base pay to go into retirement savings and investing. So that's a good reason to invest. You should also start investing once you've paid off high interest debt. So high interest debt like credit card debt, that's something that needs to be paid off before you invest for sure. So if you have some lower interest debt like a mortgage on a house or some student loans, you can still invest a little bit before prioritizing paying off that debt. But if it's high interest like a credit card that you haven't paid off, pay off that credit card before you start investing. And then second, you have long-term goals that require a lot of cash, like buying a home. Investing is a good way to grow your money by a larger amount than saving. So, before we dive into how to save, I just want to clarify some saving jargon or vocabulary. So, interest refers to money you owe when you borrow or are paid when you're lending and saving. So interest goes both ways. If you have a loan to buy a car, you are going to owe interest on that money that you borrowed. But if you have a savings account, you're going to earn interest for stocking that money away. So interest is the amount you gain. The interest rate is just the rate at which you earn interest, in this case when we're talking about savings and investment. It's typically expressed as an annual percentage rate, or APR. So 2% interest means you earn 2% of that base amount per year, or however often that it compounds. Compounding is when interest is added to the principal amount or the starting amount, and it's also added on to past interest. I like this second definition a little bit more. It can be thought of as interest on interest. So the best way to explain compounding is with an example. And compounding is a pretty powerful tool. In fact, some people even refer to it as the miracle of compounding. In fact, if you Google miracle of compounding, you'll find a bunch of cool examples like the one I'm about to do. But we're just going to do a simple compounding problem to show you how cool it is to grow your wealth when you save and invest. So let's say you start by saving up $100, and you put that $100 in an account with a 2% interest rate, and it compounds, which means the interest is added into your account annually. Now, really, most savings account will compound monthly, but let's just assume, for the sake of simple math, that everything compounds annually. So you put $100 in that first year, and you're going to earn 2% by the end of the year. So 2%, or 0.02 in decimal form, times 100 is $2. You can type that into a calculator if you don't believe me. So at the end of the year, you're going to have $102 in your account. Now, if in year 2, you don't touch your money, now you have $102 in your account, and you're going to earn 2% again. So 0.02, and we're going to multiply that by not just the $100, but also that extra $2 you had earned the previous year, 102. So that's going to turn into $2.04, and you're going to have a total of $104.04. So you actually earn more the second year than you did the first year. And it continues to grow. So in the third year, now I've got 104.04. We multiply that times 2%. And we're going to wind up with $2.08. So my new account total is going to be $106.12. So we could keep doing this, but as you can see, the interest that you earn every year goes up every year. So the longer you can leave your money alone and not touch it and continue to grow it at 1%, 2%, even if you start investing 6 and 7%, the growth is going to increase exponentially over time. And that's the miracle of compounding, is when you earn interest over interest. Your savings, the sooner you start, the more potential they have to grow. So next term is annual percentage rate, APR. That's the interest rate expressed annually. And then you might hear or see the term APY, annual percentage yield. So that's the amount of interest expressed as a percentage, but it includes the compounding. So the more frequently you compound, as we did here, the more quickly that interest will grow. So the APY is typically a little bit higher than the APR, depending on how frequently the account compounds. And this last term here is FDIC insurance. It stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Company, and sometimes it's just called FDIC insurance. It's a specific program, insurance that guarantees if a bank fails, you do not lose any money up to $250,000 per depositor and per account type. So if you decide to save, you should always go with an FDIC insured bank. That way you can't lose money. Now remember, with investing, you can lose money. FDIC insurance does not apply to investing. That's a little bit riskier. But with savings, your money is protected. So what to look for here in a savings account? That first thing you want to look for is that member FDIC. Most banks will have it at the bottom of the fine print on their website or at a sign outside the brick and mortar bank. Most banks are FDIC insured. It's almost a given, but a lot of the newer banks that are targeted towards young and experienced investors, those trendy startup banks, they might not be, so double check with those. The second thing you want in a savings account is that it is high earning. The higher that APY, the better. Typically, an online bank is going to offer a higher APY than a traditional bank with brick and mortar stores, than like Regions or Wells Fargo. And the reason the online banks can offer more of that is because they don't have the cost of maintaining that building, paying employees to be in that building, and to do customer service things constantly. So online banks tend to have higher interest rates. They can afford to pay you more interest because they don't have those extra costs. And the last thing you want in a savings account is no monthly fee. If your bank is charging you a fee just to have the account itself, look for a different bank and a different account. There are plenty of banks out there that will not charge you a monthly fee. They might have other requirements that you have, like set up automatic transfers per month or maintain a minimum balance, but you certainly shouldn't pay just to have the bank itself. You should always do your research. You should compare different accounts and banks, also called financial intermediaries. Again, I have a lot of links at the end of the PDF slides where you can compare. So you can Google best savings accounts and find a lot of these criteria listed out and pick one that works for you. All right, so when you pick the type of account you want to have to save, there are 3 different types. There is high yield savings, the traditional savings account. Now remember, on that first slide, I said the national average interest rate was 0.05% APY, but a high yield savings account can earn around 1% APY. They do change on the regular depending on what interest rates across the country are doing and their competitors are offering. So if you, for example, me, I have a high yield savings account that I opened a few years ago. At the time when I opened it, that savings account was earning over 2% interest. Now, since interest rates have fallen in response to a lot of the bank responses to the pandemic, my high yield savings account is a little bit under 1%. So they do change, which is one of the downsides to these high yield savings. But just remember, high yield is better than the traditional, what you're going to get with your standard bank account. In fact, I have a little calculator here from a website called Bankrate that's going to show you the difference in a high yield savings account versus a traditional one. So let's just assume here you have $1,000 that you want to put into a savings account. You could contribute a little bit more monthly to that account, but let's just assume you don't. You just want somewhere safe to store your $1,000 over the next 5 years. If you put it in a traditional savings account that is not high yield, you probably are earning the national average of 0.05%. That means after 5 years, you will have earned $2.50 in interest. So not much at all for not touching $1,000 for 5 years. On the other hand, if you pick one of these high yield savings account with an interest rate that's around 1%, you can make $51. So just picking an account with a higher percentage here is going to make a big difference in terms of the interest that you can earn. So definitely go with a high yield savings account. And again, a lot of the resources that I have linked at the end here will have comparisons of the best high yield savings accounts and things like that. So the good news of a traditional savings account, or the pros, is that a lot of them have flexibility for withdrawals. So the federal government does regulate how often you can withdraw from a savings account. That applies to all three of these. The maximum is about 6 times per month. So if you are going to put money in one of these accounts, know it is to save. It is not like a checking account where you can be pulling it out all the time. So 6 times per month is the federal limit, and sometimes the banks or companies themselves might have a stricter limit. You can also open a lot of high yield savings account with low or no minimum balances. Some just require $1, a penny. The one I have, I think, had a low to no minimum of $1 or even $0. There's a bank called Synchrony, but you can find a bunch of online banks that offer similar products. The downside is that typically a high yield savings account is only going to be offered by those online banks. So that means you're not going to have as much access to customer service, right? If you have an issue with your transfers and you need to talk to somebody on the phone, they might not have somebody on the phone for you to talk to. And then also the rates change depending on what the market rate is. The second type of savings account is a money market account. Be careful not to confuse this with another very similar term, money market mutual funds. That's totally different, and that is tied to the investment world. But a money market account is a savings account with more checking features. So like a checking account, you're going to have more access to your money. You're probably going to have the ability to write checks from that account. You may even have a debit card to access your money in that account. So that's kind of nice. And some of them pay higher interest than the high yield savings account, plus they have those perks for accessing your money. The downside to a money market account is that they're going to have high minimum balances. Some require you to keep several $100s in there. Some require up to $10,000 minimums to keep the account open and have those perks. I don't know about you guys, but when I got started, I did not have an extra $10,000 to throw around, so that didn't really work for me. And also their rates are subject to change, just like with the high yield savings accounts. The last way to save is through something called a certificate of deposit, or a CD. So this savings account has a fixed term length. That means there's an amount of time where you put money in there and agree not to touch it until that date of withdrawal. It's called a maturity date. So because you agree not to access those funds for a set amount of time, that's going to offer the highest interest rates of these three choices. So the downside is you can't access that money. The upside is you're going to earn more because you promised not to touch that money. Also, unlike these two, once you purchase a CD, your rate is locked in for the term. So if I had bought a CD a couple years ago when rates were high and put savings in there, I would be earning more interest than I am now with my high yield savings account. So that's a big pro if you can get a CD while rates are high. The biggest downside is you cannot access that money. You can buy a 3-month CD, you can buy a 5-year CD. Obviously, the longer the term for that CD, the more interest you're going to earn. So that's not a great place to put an emergency fund, because if you have emergency funds in a CD and you need to access those funds right away, you're going to have a huge penalty for withdrawing your CD before the maturity date. They also have minimum purchases a lot of the time. So again, ranging from a few $100s to a few $1,000s. So The one I'd recommend to most people getting started is probably one of these high yield savings accounts. All right, so that's savings. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the way to really grow your wealth over time is by investing. Again, this one has risk. You can pretty much save risk-free at any financial institution that's a member FDIC. So that is not going to be true of investing here, right? If you're going to get the reward, you have to get some risk on your side. So I do have 6 main steps that we're going to break down here. Before we start with step 1, I want to define some investing terms. And again, I am just scratching the surface here with investing terms. I could have a whole class on investing. These are just some basic terms to get us started. When I talk about assets, these are types of investments. They have the potential to gain value over time. So a share of stock, bonds, real estate. These are all examples of financial assets and sometimes just called investments, right? These category of financial tools. Contributions is a term I'm going to use to mean money that you put in an investment account. So it's just a deposit into one of those accounts. A brokerage or a broker is the company or the firm that helps you invest. They maintain your account. They manage your assets. They buy them. They sell them. They provide you with tools and apps to keep an eye on your account. So some common brokerages are companies like Vanguard, Charles Schwab, Fidelity, E-Trade, TD Ameritrade. These are all brokerages. They have different types of accounts that you can open with them and different types of investments that you can place in those accounts. The Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. This is a government agency that enforces tax law. We're talking about making money here. There's a few certainties in life, death and taxes. The IRS will get their cut one way or another. You got to follow their rules. Vesting or vested schedules. To be vested in something means to have rights of ownership over it. So this is especially important when we talk about the benefits that your employer provides you for investing in a retirement account. A lot of times there is a delay to having ownership over your retirement account, and they give that a fancy term. They said 5 years till you're vested or something like that. So it just means you don't actually have your retirement benefits for a certain amount of time. A withdrawal penalty, this applies to savings as well. This is fees that you have to pay if you access your funds early from a locked account. It applies to those CDs that we were talking about in the savings section, but it also applies to a lot of retirement benefits and retirement type accounts too. A capital gain is when you sell an asset for more than you purchased it for. So for example, if you bought a share of Amazon stock 5 years ago and sold it today, you would make some capital gains off of it. And stock is ownership in a company, a specific firm's claim on partial ownership. So if you own a stock of Amazon or a share of stock of Amazon, you own a tiny bit of the company Amazon, right? How much that company would be worth if they completely liquidated. Shares are the pieces of that stock. So if I talk about shares, if I talk about a share of stock, we're talking about ownership in a specific company. Shareholders are the folks who own shares of stock. Dividend is another way a lot of assets can make you money. They are direct payments from the firm to the shareholders. So, step 1 for investing is to pick the type of account you want. There are 2 main types of accounts that I'm going to cover. There are technically more than that, but these are the ones that individuals can open for themselves. The first one is a standard brokerage account. So these are sometimes called a taxable brokerage account or a non-retirement account. Standard brokerage accounts you can open with almost any brokerage firm. They're going to give you access to buy all kinds of investments and hold them in that account. stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate, all that good stuff. The thing about standard brokerage accounts is they are for anybody to earn money. So you are going to have to pay taxes to the IRS on any money that you make from the assets that you put in that standard brokerage account. So this could include capital gains. So like I said, if you were to sell a share of Amazon stock this year, and you sell it for a higher price than you originally bought it for, you're going to get a form from your brokerage firm when tax season rolls around, and you are going to have to claim that as income and pay tax on it to the IRS. So you will have to pay taxes on your capital gains and also your dividends. So a dividend, again, is even if you don't sell a stock, sometimes you will get some earnings from the firm. A lot of times when a company makes some profit, they will return a share of that profit to their shareholders. So depending on how many shares you own, you get a little slice of that profit. Sometimes it's just a few cents, sometimes it can be $1, but they can add up if you own multiple shares of these stocks paying dividends. So if you earn some of those dividends, you're also going to have to pay taxes on those, even if you don't sell stock. So if you open a standard brokerage account and you own assets, be aware you will be paying taxes on it. The upside to a standard brokerage account is you can contribute however much you want, and you can access your money whenever you want. You can sell those assets. Hopefully, the idea is you bought them for less than you wind up selling them for. Hopefully, you don't end up selling them for a loss, though I have sold plenty of shares of stock for a loss when I made a bad investment, and I just treated it as a learning experience. But you can access whatever the value of the assets in your account are at any time. You just have to pay taxes on any profits you make off of them. So a lot of my students, a lot of the reason I got started and am touching on this topic is because many of my students have standard brokerage accounts because there are a lot of cool, trendy investing apps that are trying to get young people and new investors excited about the possibility of investing. So I have some of those common apps or companies. These are brokerage firms listed here on the side. The only one I've ever had any experience with is the middle one, Robinhood. And it was actually my first experience in saving and investing is I opened a Robinhood account. I still have the account from my college days. I don't have a lot of money in there now. If I knew then what I know now, I probably would not have started with a Robinhood account. And I'll give a summary at the end of this slides of how I would get started if I were in your shoes, so you can maybe make better decisions than I did. But a lot of students get started with these because they allow you to get started either for free. Robinhood is marketed as having no fees. These other two, Acorns and Stash, they charge $1 per month. And they each have their own little gimmicks. So Acorns, you can get started investing just by rounding up the amount of dollars that you spend. So if you buy a cup of Starbucks coffee for $3.50, 50 cents will go into your Acorns account, and they let you buy investments with 50 cents. So that's pretty cool. If you're like, where am I going to find the money to start experimenting with this? That's kind of Acorns thing. Stash, they charge $1 per month, and they help you a lot more. They have a lot more educational resources on the app. Robinhood has no fees, doesn't have any of those cool perks, right? You're kind of in the driver's seat there. Now, I don't think these apps are a bad thing. I think they're really cool, and one of the founding tenets of a lot of these is making investing and saving more accessible to people who don't have a lot of money to start off with, and I think that's excellent. The problem with that is it's very easy for inexperienced people to get in over their heads. So I have some things to watch out for on these apps. First is the monthly fee. So like I said, Robinhood doesn't have one as far as I know. I'm certainly not paying one. The other two charge $1 per month. Now you might be thinking, well, $1 per month, that's not much at all. And that might be true, but if we think about that as a percentage of the amount you're investing, if you were to put $500 in a stash account to play around with and invest with, $1 per month is equivalent to a 2.4% brokerage fee, right? That they're charging you to use their services. And that's actually much, much higher than anything you would pay at a lot of the competitive brokerages for a personal financial advisor. So the fees, while they might not look very large on their face, if you're only investing small amounts of money, you can lose your money to those fees very, very quickly. Now, the other side of that is a traditional brokerage firm might not invest $500 for you. Right? A personal advisor might say they need more than $500 to get you started. So that's the plus side, right? Higher fees if you want to get started with a smaller amount. The other thing you need to look out for are trading fees. Again, I don't have experience with two of these apps. Robinhood does not charge trading fees, but sometimes they will charge you a few bucks for buying or selling a share of stock. The other thing is understanding risk. Again, like I said, the idea here is to make all of these complex investment tools available to more people with less resources, which is wonderful, but if you don't understand the investments that you are buying and selling, you can get in over your head very, very quickly. In fact, I heard a really, really sad story about a young 20-year-old investor on the Robinhood app who started trading a type of financial asset called options, which are very complicated. I don't trade options, but essentially it's the opposite of buying stock. You're betting against a stock and hoping that the value will go down over time, is the simplified version of explaining it. But his options trading, he thought or assumed that he lost a lot of money on the app and wound up committing suicide because he thought he had gotten himself into an insurmountable amount of debt. So you have to understand what you are buying and selling when you are on these apps, and do not buy investments that you can't understand, that you can't explain in simple terms. Stock, fairly easy to understand. A small fraction of ownership of a company. Options, very complicated. So I don't trade anything, any of the flashy stuff that a lot of my young, enthusiastic investor type students are excited about, like foreign exchange currencies, cryptocurrencies, options. I don't day trade. I don't do any of the fancy stuff because, frankly, I don't have the time to research it all, and I'm not going to put my money into an asset that I don't understand. Another thing is margin trading. I know Robinhood offers it. It's called Robinhood Gold. That means for a small fee, you can borrow money from the brokerage itself to invest. I don't recommend this at all. It is super risky, right? You're already taking a risk investing your own money. You start investing other people's money, you can dig a hole that you can't get out of very quickly. So don't do that. And then also income taxes. Like I said, any investments you put in any of these apps, you're going to pay taxes on the following year when you file taxes. So be aware that it's going to affect your taxable income if you're doing things like day trading and stuff like that. All right, so now that I have turned you off from a lot of those investor apps, if I were to get started investing, I would start actually with a retirement account. And now I know that for some of my younger students, my dual enrolled students, you might be thinking retirement is very, very far away, many years away, you're not even thinking about it, but you can get started investing and you can start growing a little amount of wealth, and the earlier you start, the better. So a retirement account is a lot like the standard brokerage account, but they have special tax advantages from the IRS. The IRS has set up incentives, meaning there are certain tax breaks built into them to try to incentivize people to start saving for retirement. There are two main categories of retirement accounts. There are workplace retirement accounts, sometimes called employer-sponsored retirement accounts. Sometimes they're called by these, number and alphabet soup looking numbers here, a 401k, a 403b, a 457b. Those terms are just meant to confuse you. They refer to the space of the tax code that outlines the rule for the IRS taxing them. The most common one that is used is a 401k. That's what most companies can offer their employees in terms of a retirement account. So when I refer to my retirement account, I might say 401k, but in reality, I have something called a 403b. They're very similar. They have some small differences, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to touch on how they're similar. So the best thing about a workplace retirement account is if you put money into that account, you can reduce your taxable income right now. So for example, if you graduate college and you get a job making $50,000 a year and your employer offers a workplace retirement account where you can contribute up to 5% of your salary. If you put in 5%, that would be $2,500 per year. At the end of the year, you don't have to pay taxes on $50,000. You pay it on $47,500. So you get to subtract out any contributions you make to a workplace retirement, most workplace retirement accounts that same year. So that's a huge benefit. Reduce the amount of taxes you have to pay on your income every year. The second big benefit and the primary benefit of a workplace retirement account is some employers match, right? So you sign this contract, you get this job offer for $50,000 a year, and they also offer you benefits. They give you health insurance benefits, and they give you retirement benefits. Some employers will match whatever you put in your account, and some do it a little bit differently. Some will match 100% of the first 3% you put in. So if we go with my same example, you put in that $2,500, they also put in $2,500, so now you have $5,000 in your account. That's free money on top of your basic salary. You should always, always, always take the employer match. Sometimes it's tiered, so they'll match 50% of the first 3%, right? So you'll put in $2,500, they'll put in $1,250, still free money. It's hard to beat a 50% or 100% return, so you should always, always take this option if possible. I know it kind of is a bummer to say goodbye to 3% of your salary when you're young and you want to buy a new car, but trust me, you will thank yourself later if you take that free money. Don't leave it sitting on the table. Some just have a flat amount they match, like the first $5,000 you put in, take it, right? Whatever they match, take the match. The other good thing about workplace retirement accounts is the contribution limits are high. So like I said, the IRS has special tax breaks for these. Because you get to avoid some taxes, in the case of a workplace retirement account, taxes that year, the maximum they'll let you put in for a year right now is $19,500 per year. I don't know about you guys, but I am nowhere close to having a spare $19,000 to put in retirement savings right now, so the odds of you approaching that limit aren't going to happen for a while. The downside to workplace retirement accounts is they have limited investment choices. Frankly, a lot of the options that they give you are terrible. They have high fees. You don't get to pick your brokerage. They pick the brokerage for you. They only give you a choice between a couple. Within those brokerage, they only give you access to specific types of investment. Those investments typically have high fees. So that is the big downside. Now, given that the investments are kind of not the best, that's still typically outweighed by that employer match. So even though a lot of your earnings in one of these accounts might get eaten away from the limited investment choices, if your employer is matching 50 or 100% of the amount of money you put in there, your contributions, it's still going to beat out the fees. So it's still worth it for that. But not every employer offers a match. If they don't offer a match, don't open an account through your employer. You can do better on your own. Vesting schedules is also an issue. So like I said, some employer retirement plans might not let you own those retirement benefits until you have worked with them and contributed to it for 5, 6, 7, sometimes even 9, 10 years. Whereas if you go with this bottom option, the individual retirement account, it's your money, right? And then lastly, the investments typically have high fees. So it goes with that first idea, limited investment choices. The second option for retiring is to do an individual retirement account called an IRA. So there's two types of IRAs you can open. There is the traditional IRA, which is meant to mimic the pros and cons of a workplace retirement account if you're not offered one. And then there's the Roth IRA. The Roth IRA has a lot of unique benefits that other retirement accounts don't, so that's the one that I personally prefer. The best advantage for these is you are in the driver's seat. So you get to pick your brokerage. You get to research who's going to have the lowest monthly account fee, if any. You're going to be able to decide the investments you pick. And you get to pick when you have a tax break, whether now or in the future. The downside to IRAs is the contribution limits are much lower. It's $6,000 a year, much different than that $19,500 a year. So, but that being said, especially as you're getting started as a young person, $6,000 is a lot to contribute right out the gate anyway. So even though it has a lower contribution limit, you probably won't reach it or want to put in more for a little bit. So those workplace retirement accounts, like I said, they're given these names. Sometimes they'll just call it a 401k. So a 401k is one of the types of accounts that are offered by most companies, a private company. A nonprofit or an educational employer will offer a very similar plan, but it will technically be called a 403b. So that's technically what I have since I work for a state college. A 457b is for government employees, so if you work for the city or something like that. There's some slight differences in how much your employer can match and how much you can contribute, but a lot of the stuff, they function pretty much the same. And the main benefit to them is that you can reduce your income tax, your taxable income, and therefore the tax that you pay on your income that same year. So it gives you a nice break in the short run. And that employer match, right? Always take the employer match if they offer one. It is free money on top of your usual pay. So always take it. Your company will pick the brokerage and the types of investment. Those fees tend to be high. We'll do an example with my own investments in my personal account versus the one that Valencia gives me, so you can see just how much those fees are going to cost me. It's a little bit depressing in a little bit, but that's the main downside with these. Now, for the individual retirement account, we've got a much lower limit, $6,000 a year. The traditional IRA, you have the advantages now. You will have to pay taxes on any earnings that you make in retirement. So that's the downside. You get the tax advantage now. You get to write it off on your taxes, if you will, if you contribute to a 401k this year. But as your money grows, once you access those contributions and the interest that your contributions have earned over the years, as it's been compounding and been in the stock market earning 6-7% annually, you're going to pay a lot more income taxes once you're retired and you start taking that money out. So that is something to consider. You get the tax break now, you do not get a tax break later. Another thing with the traditional IRA is there are really strict early withdrawal rules. So if you put $6,000 in a traditional IRA and you say, oh shoot, I actually need that money early, you have an emergency or something like that, and you don't have an emergency fund set up, the IRS is going to hit you with a 10% penalty plus income taxes. So if you're a middle-class American paying about 25% or so in income taxes, you're going to pay that on top of the 10% penalty. So if you were to withdraw $10,000 from a traditional IRA, you would probably only take home like $6,000, $6,300 after you pay that penalty and that fee. So that's a big downside, right? It's hard to access those funds early if you need them, but it's a good way to get a tax break now. The Roth IRA, and I have a little star next to it because it's the one I like, The big downside is there's no tax advantage now. You pay with them with after-tax dollars. So in my little example where you're making $50,000 a year, say you put $2,500 in a Roth IRA, you're still paying taxes on $50,000 this year. You don't get to subtract out your contributions. But the good news is you will not have to pay taxes once you access those funds when you're retired. And so all of those earnings, all of that compounding interest that you earn as that $2,500 sits in your Roth IRA account making money for you over the next 20, 30 years, you don't have to pay taxes on any of that. So that is really a huge break. It's a huge advantage. We'll do an example with some numbers here in a minute. But you could save thousands and thousands of dollars by not having to pay taxes on your earnings with a Roth IRA. Another big advantage of the Roth IRA is if you need to access your money early, you can. So you put $2,500 into your Roth IRA this year. You don't get the tax break this year. But next year, if you need to access that $2,500, you can take it out of your account without any penalty and without any taxes because you already paid taxes on them that same year. So that is the good news, is you can access those contributions early. Now, any gains on the money you put in that Roth IRA account, so say that $2,500 turns into $3,000, you can't touch that extra $500 in gains without incurring the same penalties and taxes. But you can take the initial contribution, which you cannot do with a traditional IRA or with your 401k. So the Roth IRA is the better choice for most people in the long run, and I will show you why. So this is the Roth IRA calculator, and I have this hyperlinked in both the concept guide and the PDF slides. So what I have here is just some numbers that I punched in. Let's assume that you start your Roth IRA right after you graduate college. So if you get the traditional 4-year degree, you go to school at age 18, you start making money around age 23. Let's say your first job pays you $50,000 a year and you're starting at zero, right? Because you're just starting out. If you can max out your Roth IRA, meaning you put in $6,000 a year, and that's a lot right out the gate, so you might have to work your way up to that for a few years. And you keep doing that, and you invest it in the stock market, which conservatively has a rate of return of about 6%. Some people say it's even between 7 or 9% in the long term, but let's be conservative. Let's say it's 6%, and you want to retire at age 67. Here, it's showing you the two different accounts with whether you open this blue line, your taxable account, that would be a traditional IRA or a 401k through your employer. Those are taxable after you're retired. Versus the Roth IRA. The Roth IRA, you're going to be a millionaire, right? You're going to have $1.27 million. That is your money because you don't have to pay income taxes on your earnings. You paid it on this $6,000 when you put it in every year. The taxable account, you save tax money the year you put in your money, but if you put that same $6,000 in a taxable account, all the earnings are going to get taxed when you take them out in retirement. So you're only going to have about $870,000 worth of income. So going with the Roth over the traditional one, you are going to have so much more in tax savings when you retire. These numbers here, what you will need, this is based off of your annual income, what they think you'll need per month in terms of expenses, and your IRA will cover most of that here, and you can manipulate that. So it's coming up with what you need per year based on your expected life expectancy here, which you can move up or down, and it'll change your calculator. I have it at 85. It's a little bit higher than the U.S. average lifespan, so be a little bit optimistic, save a little extra, hope we live longer. And so this is pretty incredible. So just by maxing out your IRA as soon as you can, if you start at 23 and you get a good job right out of the gate here at Valencia, and you start right away putting away that $6,000, you won't miss it, right? If you can do it, you won't miss it. And you just invest in the stock market, bam, you can be a millionaire by 2063. So pretty cool stuff. All right, so once you've picked the type of account you want, either a standard brokerage account or a retirement account, either through your employer or an IRA, then you choose your firm. So whichever account you choose, always compare brokerage firms. There's a lot of ways to compare them online, but you definitely want a low investment minimum. Most of us do not have $10,000 out the gate to put in an investment account and start buying stuff with. High quality trading tools, so good websites and apps for you to manage your investments. Some come with good educational resources and customer service. So my Roth IRA is with a company called Vanguard. I get emails every once in a while about little webinars and things like that. I typically don't go to those. I do a lot of my research on my own. These are some websites that I really like. So if your brokerage is going to provide educational resources, there's typically some sort of trade-off associated with that, right? They're going to have higher account fees. Maybe they'll have those trading fees that I talked about. So if they're going to provide you with resources and customer service, typically that money's got to come from somewhere. So I like to use free resources instead. Nerdwallet.com is one of my favorites. They provided a lot of information that I used to make this module. Investopedia and Bankrate are also great. They have a lot of best of lists and articles that they update every month. So best high yield savings account, best brokerage firms for new investors, best mutual funds, best stocks, blah, blah, blah. One thing to keep in mind with these is a lot of these websites and a lot of their best lists are promotional, meaning maybe Charles Schwab paid them to put their brokerage account on their best brokerage account list. So look for the criteria and keep that criteria in mind when you're looking at those best lists and cross-check them against the different sites so that you don't get scammed. Always look for low or no fees. Common fees are called brokerage fees. So they're sometimes called account service fees, right? They might charge you annually or monthly just for having the account. My company that I have my Roth IRA with, they charge a $20 account service fee, but they waive it if you opt in for electronic notifications instead of paper mailing. So I got around that fee just by opting in to get all my information, my account statements and stuff electronically instead of through the mail. Some brokerages charge you for inactivity. You don't want that, right? You don't want to have to be moving your money around. Some will try to sell you subscriptions to their best investment research. And sometimes they will charge you fees to access a higher class of investment tools. Try to avoid these if possible. They're out there. Just do your research and find the ones that are best. Trade commission, we already talked about this with some of those trendy investing apps. They might charge you a fee when they buy or sell your assets. If you can get around them altogether, or the lower they all are, the better. And a big one is the expense ratio. So this is a fee that is tied to a particular asset. And it's a fee that is a percentage of how much of that asset you own. And those can add up quite quickly. So step 3 is to apply to open an account with the brokerage you chose and open it. So look for eligibility. For most accounts, you have to be 18 or older. You have to have a social security number or a tax ID number because you have to be able to pay taxes if you have a standard brokerage account and write off taxes if you have a 401k, something like that. And for retirement accounts, to get the tax breaks tied to them, you have to have earned income. You can't contribute more to your retirement account than you claimed as earned income on your tax return. So if you get a bunch of tax write-offs and you want to stick some extra money into your retirement account, that can get you in trouble with the IRS. So don't try to game the tax system. And also look for contribution, income, and withdrawal limits. We've already talked about these somewhat. For a standard brokerage account, you don't have to worry about contribution limits. You don't have to worry about withdrawing it. You get the most access to it because you are paying taxes on it as you are buying and selling financial assets. You have to pay taxes that year. Now, a workplace retirement account, they have a very, very high contribution limit, $19,500. If you access your money early, right, before retirement, before you're 59 and a half, you got that 10% penalty and taxes. And that's for any withdrawals, your contributions, your gains, any of it. You're going to get hit with that penalty. Pretty hefty. IRAs, you can contribute up to $6,000 per year. Try to max it out. I would say this is the deal of the century. And the Roth. With the Roth, you don't have any penalties or taxes if you access your contributions. The thing about the Roth IRA is you can only contribute that maximum $6,000 if your annual income is under $124,000 per year. Most people, whether when they graduate college or anytime when they enter the workforce, they're going to start closer to that $50,000 range. They're not going to hit six-figure income for many, many years later in their life. So contribute to your Roth IRA while you can. If you're going to make $124,000 or more per year, when you get to that point, you won't be able to have a Roth IRA. You're just going to be too wealthy. So the IRS will not let you take advantage of that great tax break if you're that wealthy. So contribute to it now while your income's low. With the Roth IRA, you do have to pay penalties if you access your earnings, right? So anything you contribute, you can take back out, but if that money you contribute grows, you can't take the part that it grew from your investments without penalty. There are some exceptions though. If it's a purchase for your first home, you can access up to $10,000 in earnings as long as the account's at least 5 years old, which is nice for later. So if you're, 23 or 25 and you start maxing out your Roth IRA account, and then by the time you turn 30, you're ready to buy your first home, you can dip into that Roth IRA account if you want to do that. Though I recommend leaving it as much as you can because you can't replace the money, right? You can only put $6,000 per year. So try to put as much in there as you can. With the traditional IRA, any withdrawals, whether it's contributions or earnings, you're going to be hit with that big penalty and taxes. All right. Step 4, this is the part that really intimidates a lot of people. So you've chosen an account, you applied, you open it, but now the idea of, okay, what do I buy with my money and how much do I put in and how often do I put that money in and how do I make the right choices? What if I lose money? That is the petrifying part of this process that stops a lot of people. So I'm just going to try to give you some basic tips that I have, but we got to start with some investment terms. So one type of financial asset you can buy is a bond. A bond is a financial contract. It's like a piece of paper that says, I owe you a certain amount of money at a specific date. So it's a way to make a loan. You can buy corporate bonds. So for a business, you can lend a business money and they'll pay it back over a certain amount of time. You can buy municipal bonds. That would be like with the city government. You can buy treasury bonds. That's through the U.S. government. And they all work the same way. It's something with a set maturity date that you will get the money back that you lent when you bought the bond, plus interest when you sell the bond and when it matures. The term bear market and bull market just means how does the value of stocks overall tend to be changing over time. If stock prices are generally falling, that's called a bear market, and investors tend to feel pessimistic. So when the pandemic hit and the economy started falling, right, we were experiencing a bear market. Prior to the pandemic, we had a bull market. That's when the market is on the rise. Investors are optimistic and spending a lot of money. The economy seems strong. So a good way to memorize the difference between those is the sharp parts about a bull and a bear. So bear claws swipe down. It's down towards the bottom of their body. A bull has horns on the top of their head, so that means the market's going up. Blue chip. Blue chip just describes a really reliable company, a good one to buy stock from as an asset because it's reliable. They have a history of good earnings, low risk. Diversification. This is a strategy of investing in a wide range of companies and a wide range of assets altogether, bonds and stock and real estate. And if you spread your wealth over these assets, you have less risk. A mutual fund. This is an investment program. So investors pool all their money together and they use those funds to buy a whole bunch of different assets, stocks and bonds, etc. And then each investor gets a little bit of a slice of each of those assets that the fund was used to buy. So it allows people to diversify, buy a wide variety without having to do it all on their own, right? It's cheaper. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, sometimes abbreviated DJIA, sometimes it's called the Dow Jones or the Dow. It is just an index on how 30 blue chip US companies are doing, so 30 really strong company stocks, how they're performing over time. It's often used to represent all of the stock market. So when people say, oh, the stock market is down today, they're probably talking about the Dow. They're using it as a reflection of the entire stock market when really it's just a tiny, tiny fraction, right? 30 companies. Exchange traded funds or ETFs. This is like a mutual fund where it's an asset that is made up of a bunch of different assets pooled together and then split off into little pieces. So it's like a mutual fund in that way, but you don't have to buy into the whole fund. You can buy and sell it like stock with a much smaller amount of money. Mutual funds will require that you put typically a large sum in ahead of time, like $1,000 minimum or $3,000 minimum. Exchange traded funds, you can buy and sell it like a share of stock. They tend to be expensive stocks, but less expensive than a mutual fund. Equity market is just another term of the stock market. So if you own equities, they'd probably mean stock versus bonds or real estate. An index, this is a tool to measure groups of assets. So like that Dow Jones, that's an index that measures 30 blue chip stocks. An index fund is a mutual fund that buys stocks to mimic what an index like the Dow is representing. So whatever those 30 stocks are that make up the Dow, you could get a Dow Jones index fund, and basically you're going to get a little slice of each of those 30 companies. It's just meant to mimic the index itself by one person buying and selling stocks with a bunch of investors' money. Market capitalization, also called market cap, that's how big the financial impact of a company is. It's if you take the share price multiplied by how many shares of stock are out there circulating, that's the market cap. So terms like large cap and mid cap just has to do with the value, the total value of that company if it were to be liquidized. So large companies have market caps in the billions of dollars, right? Even though their share price might only be $100 because it's all of those shares added up together. The NASDAQ is a US market for stocks. It's another index like the Dow. So if people talk about what the NASDAQ is doing, it's just another index for stocks. A portfolio, or if people talk about your portfolio, it's your collection of investments. So if you say my portfolio is up, that means your financial assets and investments are increasing in value and stuff like that. The S&P 500, yet another index that is very common and used to measure the health of the stock market as a whole. It tracks 500 US companies. The S&P stands for Standard & Poor's. It's a credit rating agency that used to rate the financial stability of different companies and has since become the standard for investors to find reliable stocks and companies. Ticker symbol, this is the abbreviation used to identify an asset. So for example, if you were to buy a share of Apple stock, the ticker symbol is APPL. right? I hope that's right. I haven't checked on my Apple stock in a while. So, but it's just a symbol to represent things. All right, choosing your investments. Now, I said that step 4 is where a lot of people will be petrified and be stopped from engaging in this process at all, but please don't let fear stop you, right? There is a huge opportunity cost here if you do not participate in the world of saving and investing, and that's that potential $1 million I just showed you on that Roth IRA. But there is risk. Accept that you might make a mistake and you might choose a bad investment and you might lose your money, right? As you're getting started, treat this like a learning process and don't put too much wealth until you build your confidence and understanding in these markets. You do not earn anything without risking a little bit of something. And that was kind of my attitude when I got started with Robinhood. I took a few $100, started a Robinhood account, and I just told myself it's okay if I lose every single penny of this $200, you know, and I was in college, and I just said this is going to be an investment in my learning about how investments work. And I certainly lost some money, but I also gained some money, so I don't know what my net turnout was from that first $200 because I wound up putting more money in there as I figured it out. But just having an attitude that it's okay to spend a little money or quote, quote, lose a little money to learn how to invest is, I think, a good attitude to have. But with that risk, you can classify risk using asset classes. So asset classes are groups of similar investments. Stocks are considered the highest risk, but also the highest return. That's that 6 to 7% I was talking about. So if you really want to grow your wealth over time, you need to be investing in the stock market and you need to be taking on some risk. But, you know, there's a lot of people who are investing in the stock market. We're in a recession right now. I'm recording this in 2020 during the pandemic. So right now the stock market is a volatile and scary place to put your money because there are economic fluctuations in the stock market. We'll talk about some ways to diversify and minimize that risk though. Bonds, those are less risky than stocks because depending on the ones you buy, if you buy like a treasury bond from the U.S. government, those are very reliable, right? Because the U.S. government can definitely always pay their debts. Less risky than, say, a corporate bond, but typically bonds, because they have set maturity dates and there's a set amount issued, they're less risky. They provide a steady stream of income. And then cash, that savings that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, having money in your high yield savings account, having a CD, they have low to no risk. So one of the websites that I was doing some research on, NerdWallet, had a great metaphor for these asset classes. They said that asset classes are like a car and your asset allocation is like a car. Stocks are the engine, right? They make the car go. They give it power and they get you to where you're going. Bonds are like the shocks on your car. They help smooth out the bumps in the stock market because the stock market fluctuates. There's going to be some day when you log on to your account and your portfolio is going to be down because the markets didn't perform well that day or that week or that month. And so bonds can help provide some steady income to your portfolio during those bumps. And then cash are the brakes. So that's when you need to slow down or stop altogether. That's when you can move things over there. But if you're going to have a well-developed portfolio, you need all three pieces of the car, stocks, bonds, and cash to get you to where you're going, which is trying to grow your wealth over time. Now, asset allocation is how you split it up between those. Typically, if you want aggressive growth, you need to put your money into the riskier class, which is the stocks. There is this rule of 100 for asset allocation. Most people have moved it up to the rule of 120. It's where you just subtract your age from 100 or 120, and that's the percentage of all of your investments that should go into stocks, that should have stock exposure. So if you are a young person, you're 23, just starting out, saving for retirement, you can afford to put most of your assets in a risky space. Because even if the stock market crashes horribly like it is right now during COVID-19, you're going to have your entire lifetime for that asset to recover, right? And economic fluctuations don't tend to last forever. So the market will go back up again. So if you're 23, you're going to have 80 to 90% of your assets in stocks, probably. And then as you get older, you get up into the 60s or your 70s, then you're going to want to move your assets into a more conservative space, like those bonds and cash I was talking about. Because if there's a big crash while you're approaching retirement age, you have less time for your money to recover from that economic downturn. So that's the idea behind asset allocation. Also, you can buy certain funds, mutual funds, sometimes called target date funds, where whoever is managing the mutual fund, they're going to rearrange between stocks, bonds, and cash for you based on a set retirement date for you based on your age. So that's kind of cool. All right. So, diversification, minimizing risk. So, the deal with a lot of my young students who want to buy stock in particular companies is when you buy stock in a particular company, you're basically taking on a lot of risk. So, let's suppose you have $300 that you want to start investing in the stock market. You could take that $300 and you could buy a couple of blue chip stocks. You could buy a share of Apple. Apple shares, a single share, I think is like $120 right now. They're pretty pricey. You could buy a share of Amazon. Amazon is a good, reliable company. And you could spend your $300 on two really solid companies with a great history, but all of your $300 are in those two companies. So if one of them or even both of them have a bad year, all of your money is going to decrease in value. Now, if you buy one of those terms that I defined, those funds on the first slide, a mutual fund, an ETF, or an index fund, you are going to be able to spread that $300 across a lot of companies. You'll have a little bit of Apple and a little bit of Amazon. If you pick a S&P 500 index fund, you're going to get a slice of those blue chip companies plus 498 others, right? So that is a good way for you to diversify over the long run. It's not very exciting. It's not very spicy, trying to pick and choose your companies. You just pick these kind of boring funds that are reliable and mimic what is already out there in the market as a whole. But it is a great way to diversify. Branching off of that, when we talked about employer retirement funds, a lot of employers, when they offer benefits, they'll offer you a stock option. They'll say, we can take a portion of your paycheck and invest it in this company. And a lot of times there's pressure to invest in the company you work for because you want to have faith in that company. I mean, after all, you are working for them. But you have to be very careful with that. Just like you wouldn't want to buy too many individual shares of stock in one company, because that's not very good for diversifying, you don't want to buy a bunch of your own company's stock. They will push it a lot of times as this great investment opportunity and talk about how the value is constantly going up. Well, it's probably constantly going up because people are becoming eligible to buy more and more of it every year through this stock option that the company is offering. And it's a good way for you to lose your money quickly and also lose your source of income. If your company goes out of business, not only do you lose your job, you're going to lose all the value in that investment if that's all you're buying. So I'm not saying don't buy company stock. I just would say the stock option is not as great as they make it sound, and I would not put all my eggs in one basket, as they say. The second piece of advice I have to you is don't try to beat the market. This is some old school advice. There is a famous investor, widely recognized as the most successful investor in history, named Warren Buffett. He's the CEO of a big conglomerate called Berkshire Hathaway. And like I said, he's considered the most successful investor in history. And his strategy says, or he has this quote that says, lethargy bordering on sloth should remain the cornerstone of an investment style, which means be lazy with your investments over time. You should not be trying to move them around, buy Amazon at the start of the day, sell it by the end of the day because you know that the stock's going to go up that day, and then move that money into Apple and switch it around and put it in this startup tech company and 3D printing and cryptocurrencies. Don't do that. Put it in a mutual fund, put it in an index fund, and forget about it. Because even though it might sound exciting to try and beat the market and try to take these aggressive investment strategies, they're extremely risky, right? You as an individual, it's very hard for you to have more knowledge than the market itself. So the more broadly you can diversify your funds, probably the more money you're going to make over time. And additionally, you're going to cost yourself a lot of time and effort in trying to beat the market and trying to research if you are trying to make these risky investment choices. So there's a cost to that. So Warren Buffett actually had a bet with some hedge fund managers. There he is. Look at the guy. What a happy guy. And he made $1 million bet with some young fund managers. And he basically told them, look, if I put some money in an index fund, the S&P 500 index fund, the one that tracks 500 U.S. companies, all it does is track the market. He said, I bet it will earn more money than your aggressively, actively managed fund. And these are young guys that are hired by these brokerage firms to move around their company's money over time and try to beat the market, put their investors' money in the best places. And Warren Buffett won very, very easily, I think by like almost 60%. Let's see, yeah. The hedge funds averaged 22% return, and the worst, 2.9%. The S&P earned a lot more, and so he won that bet. So trying to be fancy with it and trying to aggressively invest, if you compare the two here, you can see the S&P 500 index outperformed, looks like every year. I don't see any year where this column is greater than this column. So, Warren Buffett's a rich guy. He's made a lot of money investing, so I'm going to follow his strategy. But if there's some of my young, enthusiastic investors who want to play around with risky investments, good for you. You can certainly make money that way. It's just not a strategy that's going to work for me personally. So be lazy, use those basic funds, set them, forget them. Let's see. Another idea with those don't try to beat the markets is you need to be very wary of a brokerage firm or a manager at a brokerage firm who tells you they can beat the market. Because one, they probably can't, based on the results from Warren Buffett's bet, but also you are going to pay them for all of their efforts in trying to beat the market. And that's when you pay something called an expense ratio. An expense ratio is going to eat into your earnings. And so average expense ratios on any type of fund, a mutual fund, an exchange-traded fund or ETF, or an index fund, these are the industry averages. But if you look carefully, you can find brokerages with much, much lower expense ratios. The lower the expense ratio, the more of your own money you can keep, right? Because you don't have to pay someone to manage your fund. So I actually have an example here for you right now. So I own two different funds. One is through my Roth IRA, and its ticker symbol, if you're curious, is VTSAX. It's the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. So it's a total stock market index fund. Okay? It had a big minimum investment, $3,000. So I saved up until I could get in on that investment fund. And let's just say I put in $1,000 a year every year into that fund. I don't know exactly what I do. I'm just saying this hypothetically. And let's say I leave that fund alone for 30 years. It's in the stock market, so we're going to assume a conservative stock market return because it's indexed over the total stock market of 6%. The expense ratio on my Vanguard index fund is 0.04%, right? So if I start with $3,000, put $1,000 a month into that fund, I'm going to make $100,000 and pay $813 in fees from that little expense ratio. Now, through my employer, Lovely Valencia, I also own a fund with a ticker symbol QCEQRX. It is the CREF Equity Index Account Fund. If you take a look at it, it's an index fund for the entire stock market through a different company. So let's just assume, sorry, my dad's texting me, that same fund, I start with $3,000, I put in $1,000 a year. Do that for 30 years. It's the same fund, so it's going to have the same rate of return as my other one. But they're going to charge me an expense ratio, this company, of 0.48. If I calculate how much I'm going to make, I'm going to have $91,000, and I'm going to pay almost $10,000 in fees to them for that 0.48 expense ratio. So expense ratios can add up so quickly, right? We're talking about the difference of thousands and thousands of dollars here. So please watch for a low expense ratio. The more passively managed the fund is, the lower the expense ratio. The downside is a lot of these good funds with low expense ratios have large minimums, like the $3,000 that I just mentioned. But do your research. You might find some with lower minimums that you want. On top of the fund, you can always pay account fees through your brokerage, so look out for those too. And as usual, don't buy anything you don't understand. I know I said that before, but still do not buy a fund or an asset that you can't explain the underlying value of. Investing step 5 is to make regular payments to your account. Drip a little bit into that account each month. I like to use the low to no pain approach. So when I find extra money, I split it into thirds. A third of it goes into savings and investment. A third of it goes to my debt. I have some student loans. And a third of it I use for fun. You should reward yourself for being financially responsible. And this is not a third of all my money. This is a third of any extra money I have. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, who has extra money? Nobody has extra money. Well, here's the way to find some extra money. First is to get in the habit of setting aside 10% of your regular paycheck. If you make $600 a month, you just have a part-time job, 10% is $60. You still have $540 to do whatever you would normally do with it. You probably, if you can get started early, will not miss that $60. Then put $20 into that emergency savings or get started investing. Put $20 towards any debt that you have, and put $20 out to do something nice for yourself because you're being financially responsible. If you get into that setting aside 10% habit, and you keep that going over your life, even as your pay grows and you get better and better jobs and higher pay, you will grow money over time. Use this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split if you get a raise at work, right? The raise is something extra that you didn't have to begin with. So if you were living within your means comfortably before, take that raise and split it a third. Take a third if you get a bonus at the end of the year. If you get a tax refund, so when you file your taxes with the government and they say you're getting, $1,000 back or $800 back, that can add up really quickly. Split it up into this thirds. When you find extra money, right, someone gives you a gift, a check of some sort of gift, and you can always trim down your budget. You'd be surprised. If you can cut out your weekly Starbucks habit, you can find some extra money to split up this way. So those are just some options on getting started. Last step is to watch your money grow. So pick a few target funds like a S&P 500 index, like a total stock market fund like the one I just showed you. Anyone, research them, right? Set up some automated transfers. If you get into that habit with 10% of your paycheck and your paycheck gets dropped into your checking account every month, set up an automatic transfer from your checking account for 10% of it every single month. So you're not even tempted to spend it. It just goes into your investment account or it goes into your savings, whatever it is, and just forget about it. Set up any account that you have, if it's an investment account, to reinvest your earnings. So when the value of your assets go up or the asset pays you a dividend, just say, I want that dividend to go right back into buying more shares of this fund, right? Or more shares of stock, whatever it is that you're buying. When you reinvest your earnings, that's how you take advantage of compound interest. If you're taking those earnings out or you're not reinvesting them, there's no way to earn interest on interest. And then that miracle of compounding you don't get to take advantage of. Next, check your account every once in a while. Make sure that you haven't picked a crazy investment or fees aren't getting out of control. Your brokerage firm didn't sneak in any extra fees or anything like that. But rarely, if ever, sell it. Once you find something that's stable, consistent, low fees, leave it alone, right? Remember that Warren Buffett strategy. Lethargy bordering on sloth should be the cornerstone of your strategy. Do your research. Don't be afraid to experiment. Just don't put all of your wealth at stake. But appreciate that there's some learning that goes on beyond this. And then just shift your assets as you age, typically to less risk. All right, so this is just a big summary of everything I've talked about so far, because I know I've thrown a lot at you. So if you're getting started, I'd start with a high yield savings account, HYSA. Park your emergency savings there and decide, do I need 1 month? Do I need 6 months? Do I need something in the middle? Figure out what that number is and start putting it in that account. You grow it by using that 1/3 approach that I listed back in step 5. So when you get a bonus, when you get a raise, when you get your tax refund, start building your emergency fund. When you pick an HYSA, compare your banks. The key is you don't want a minimum balance or a low one, if anything. Don't let them charge you a monthly fee, and look for the highest APY you can get with those other features. You can look them up online. I will link those resources at the end. Watch your withdrawals. You can only withdraw 6 times per month max. Do not treat your high yield savings account like a checking account. It is savings. You're not supposed to touch it. Requires a little bit of discipline. Second, once you have your emergency fund set up, if your employer offers a company match, contribute the maximum amount you can to get the maximum match from them. If they only match 50%, it's still worth it to get all of the 50% they can match. Like I was saying earlier, the stock market returns about 6 to 7% annually. It's very hard to aggressively invest to beat a 50% match on your own. So even if they only match 50% instead of 100%, you can't beat that on your own. Take the employer match. But not every company offers one. If they don't offer a match, don't mess with your employer-sponsored retirement account. Because, like I said, like I gave you that example earlier, most employer accounts do not offer great investments. If you do have a 401k and you leave your job, a lot of times you will have the option to roll the money from your former employer's retirement account into a different one. So you could roll it into another 401k, but I would roll it into that Roth IRA. Remember, you can only contribute up to $6,000 after-tax dollars per year into a Roth IRA. One way to get around that is if you have an old 401k and you leave your job, you can roll it over into a Roth IRA, and then you can contribute far more than $6,000 if you have more in that old employer account in a year. So it's a way to get around the contribution limits. And rollovers aren't going to count against you for that contribution limit. So that's a good way to get started with a Roth IRA if you don't have $6,000 after-tax dollars to put in there. There's typically a limited amount of time that you can roll your 401k over, though. Third is to open your own retirement account, preferably a Roth IRA, because you will make more money long-term with a Roth than a traditional. Compare the brokers. I told you mine is Vanguard. They're a pretty popular one, but you can find really great Roth IRA accounts with Charles Schwab, Fidelity, all of these places. They're all very comparable. Just compare and find the one that has the features that you want. A lot of them, I gave you some good features to look out for. Research your investments. So that's back step 4 when we talk about mutual funds and index funds. And then work your way up to contribute the maximum you can every year, $6,000, so long as you're making less than $124,000 per year. So a good way for you to start building your wealth early. Lastly, if you have extra money left after you've made all your emergency savings, you're maxing out your Roth, you're getting the maximum employer match on your 401k, try a standard brokerage account. Play around with Robinhood or Acorns or Stash. And mess around with that money, and try playing with things. Just do not put so much wealth at stake, and do not buy things that you don't understand. Again, I'm warning against those things like options and cryptocurrencies and all those fancy things that these apps let you buy, but can be very risky. So all of these steps are based on my personal experience. Like I said, I started with a standard brokerage account on one of those trendy apps. In retrospect, I wish I would have opened a high-yield savings account first, put up some emergency savings. Then someone told me about what the employer match was, and then I would have opened my Roth IRA and just bought a few mutual funds and then played around with stocks. Because that's the way to grow wealth over time and be practical. It's not, shiny and exciting, but that's what would have worked for me. And then there's this huge disclaimer at the end that I'm not a financial advisor. There are people whose job it is to give you these tips and to advise you on how to invest and save money. And I am not a licensed financial advisor by any means. I'm just telling you guys what worked for me and what I wish I knew when I was just entering the working world. What's best for you, though, is going to depend on how old you are, how much income you have, are you living within your means, how sensitive are you to risk, are you really risk averse and you don't like the idea of losing any money, in which case investing may not be for you at all. If you have a lot of high interest debt, like credit card debt, that's a totally different thing that you need to look into first. So these are just some steps that I think are a good way, if you're at a point in your life where you have extra income, to begin growing and investing and experimenting with to do this sort of thing. Here are these resources that I talked about. Those 3 websites are my fave online websites that I check out regularly, and I learn things on them still now today. There's always terms that I don't know. So if you don't know a term, you can go into NerdWallet or Bankrate and type in, what is a hedge fund, right? And it'll give you an article with a nice explanation. So that's really great. Again, watch out for promotional material on these websites. A lot of them, what they advertise as the best savings account might be promotional. So just always get around that and watch out for that by looking at multiple sites and checking out the fees and the things that really matter. One book that I really like is The Smartest 401k Book You'll Ever Read. I have it linked here on Amazon. That's where I learned that the expense ratios from my employer account are ridiculous, and that you shouldn't take the employer stock option. It's very short. I like that book. Science of Money is another good one. The Stacking Benjamins podcast is actually kind of fun if you want something to listen to while you're driving and reading's not your thing. You can get some good money tips there. And then another great group I want to recommend is the Valencia College Financial Learning Ambassadors Program. They offer a lot of information and skill shops on savings and investment, but they also cover other aspects of personal finance, like budgeting and credit cards and debt and all kinds of really important things. The world of personal finance is very vast and deep, so this is just one piece, savings and investment, and we didn't even cover all of it. So always be learning and researching. I have some other links, some of those calculators that I showed, and other resources that we've used or that I used to kind of create this content. Again, all of this will be linked in the PDF version of this presentation. So that's all I got for you. I hope that this was semi-helpful, that you learned some things that you wish you learned in high school. I know I did. And reach out to me if you have any questions.